Coming to paperback and Kindle this fall, E-Steam Blast from the Past. Hell's aspiring angel takes on her demonic doppelganger in this time-traveling, action-packed E-Steam series adventure. Pre-order your copy of E-Steam Blast from the Past on Kindle with a bonus E-Steam comic forward for the paperback this fall. In a recent Bounding into Comics article, writer Aubrey Stitterson, formerly of a G.I. Joe comic for IDW Comics, called for the formation of a union for comic book writers and artists. Now, this proposal to talk about forming a union is hilarious because it clearly shows that your Aubrey Stitterson really does not understand the comic book industry and where it stands in the world of publishing, nor does he understand what unions usually organize for. Now, historically, your unions usually formed as related to work positions where management was in a position to have a lot of profit as related to the workers' labor. And when you look at comic books today, and if you look at comic books historically, comic books have never been a high-value product outside of the secondary market, because in the secondary market, comics go up in value only due to the whole economic concept of scarcity and demand for scarce products. That's the only reason why comics have a value as related to pop culture, is because we lost quite a few during the Golden Age as related to paper drives during World War II, and we lost a lot of comics during the Silver Age and throughout the Bronze Age because comics were always considered disposable material, and most people just considered them something that was cheap and easy to read, and they usually just threw them away after a couple of years. So most of the value as related to comics is primarily tied to the secondary market, and they were never considered an economic asset by their publishers. Most publishers historically have seen comics as a low-tier product as related to their publications, and they've always seen comics as something that they just published just to get a few fast dollars at places like grocery stores, places like drugstores, and places like convenience stores. It was never considered a high money, high value asset. So most of the employees who worked on comics were never considered high value employees, the same way auto workers were considered high value employees, construction workers were considered high value employees, and railroad workers were considered high value employees. And the reason why auto workers, construction workers, and people who worked in the railroads were considered high-value employees and could unionize is because, one, your auto workers, your railroad workers, and your construction workers had specialized skills, and because they had specialized skills, they were considered an asset to those owners, and though they were building a material, tangible material, that would build wealth later on. So they had something of value to offer the owners, and because they had something of value to offer the owners, they could leverage those specialized skills and that labor in exchange for higher prices for their labor. Meanwhile, in contrast, your comic pro cannot really leverage anything as related to value for their labor because art is subjective, one, and two, comics, again, are not considered a high value asset to publishers and have never been considered high value assets to publishers. And because they're not considered high value assets to publishers, they cannot really unionize or even think about organizing a union because they bring nothing of significant value to these publishers as related to print comics. So a lot of these comic pros, they think that this is some sort of big time deal, but it's not a big time deal. Usually, again, the comic pro, whether they be a writer or an artist, is usually a low tier person, and because they are not working on their own intellectual property, they usually are considered work for hire employees. And from the position of a work for hire position, you are just usually being contracted by that publisher to fulfill a role on the project. So usually most comic pros are considered, again, work for hire contract workers because, one, they do not own any of the intellectual property, and two, they have no control over the finished product as related to how it is published. So your average comic pro, they cannot really have any demand higher value unless they can generate sales. And these days, most comic pros are not generating enough sales in order to leverage to get higher prices for their work. Because when you do the math these days, the average comic pro is paid anywhere from $50 to $250 a page for art, or paid anywhere from $10 to $110 for a page of script. And when you do the math on those numbers, they turn out to be about $1,100 to $5,500 for the art, and anywhere from $220 to about $1,300 or $1,400 for a script. That's not even enough money to cover rent here in New York City for an apartment and many other parts of the country. So if these workers were to try to call themselves unionizing, they wouldn't really have any sort of leverage as related to the publishers because, again, they're not selling enough units out here to be able to say they're an asset to the company. Because in order to demand higher wages, you have to show that the products you are helping to produce have a value. And most comics today still are considered low tier as related to being products, and they don't produce anything of significant value because they aren't really selling in the numbers that would be able to leverage any sort of raise for the workers. So you have to sell, I say, at least about 250 to 300,000 copies in order to show any sort of asset to corporate owners like Disney and AT&T. And in order for them to take people seriously, they need to see those types of six-figure numbers or even higher numbers like 500,000 to 1 million to even consider thinking about hearing any sort of demands from any sort of freelancer who's working on a comic. So they're sitting there, Aubrey Stitterson is proposing, oh, we need to form a union, but again, you don't have any sort of product that makes it where you can build some sort of leverage to say that people desperately need this, and that if these workers went on strike, this would actually hurt the business, or this would actually hurt the overall economy. I mean, this is the type of leverage that union workers have. I mean, when auto workers when they go on strike, it affects the economy of local communities, and politicians will put some pressure on people. And when workers like here in New York in the transit union decide not to go to work, the whole city does not go to work. And outlying states like New Jersey and Connecticut, people who work out there can't go to work. So that type of leverage means that these people who work in union jobs can make demands of their employers to pay them a living wage. And they can make those demands because they offer a product or a service that is an asset to society. And because they are offering products and services that are assets to society, they can look at it and go, yeah, we can unionize because we have something that people need, we have something people demand, and we have something of value to everybody's everyday life. A comic book, while it may be entertaining and may be fun for a handful of people, is not something that has an essential need to the average American out here or the average person in the world. If people miss one issue of Superman or one issue of Spider-Man, it's not going to stop them from being able to go about their everyday. I mean, that's not something people are going to practically lose everything over if the writer of Superman decides to go on strike. I mean, if the writer and artist of Superman or Spider-Man decides to go on strike, people will adapt. People will find other forms of entertainment. They can go to Netflix, they can go to Hulu, they can go read web comics, they can go read comics online. So there's no real value to society as related to a monthly comic, and that's something Aubrey Stitterson does not really understand about unions, is that unions form because they provide essential services, and they do this because they know they have leverage to make a deal with management because they are providing essential services that are an asset to the community and provide something of value to the overall quality of life in the community. And if those items are taken out of the community, people will suffer. So they have something of value they can offer in exchange for those higher wages if they demand them once their contract ends, and they can demand job security because their workers are assets to the community because of the specialized skills that they have. But a comic book writer or a comic book artist is not somebody who is considered somebody who is essential to society as related to the everyday goings-on about life. That's why most publishers consider them work-for-hire employees, because they don't really need them outside of trying to maintain their trademarks. Because when it comes down to this intellectual property, the only reason why many comic book companies are in business right now, especially Marvel and DC, is because your Disney and your Time Warner primarily only want to keep these catalogs in place so that they can maintain this large catalog of trademarks. Because in trademark law, you have to use these images of these characters every 10 years in order to ensure that you can still secure the trademark. Now, copyright is in place for as long as the publisher is around, and plus 70 years. I mean, no, it's long for, I think, about till the end of the life of the individual. That's where copyright is. Copyright is around for as long as the person is alive, plus about 70 years. But trademarks, which is on visuals and pictures and images, these have to be used every 10 years in order for a business, in order to ensure that they can continue saying that this is their intellectual property. So the only reason why many comic publishers remain in business is primarily so these companies can continue to maintain their trademarks, and because they have over 3,000, 4,000 characters, they can just publish these books at a loss while they go out here and use that catalog of characters in other more profitable ventures like merchandising, things such as action figures, movies, video games, and other merchandise like t-shirts and other items. So these companies usually just use the comic book business as a place to protect their intellectual trademarks, and that's about it as related to your comic book. So that's why the whole unionization would fall completely apart because there's nothing they can leverage as related to anything because you're just, again, another contract worker. And as a contract worker, you're just hired to just do your piece right here. You have no sort of ownership of any rights that you can leverage, and you have no ownership of anything as related to the intellectual property you're working on. Once you do your work on that property, it may be celebrated by many comic fans out here, but it does not generate wealth for a creator. And this is why so many creators like Todd McFarlane, like Ethan Van Sciver, and many others out here, when they talk about going out here to do comics these days, they do their own comics because they understand in order to generate wealth, you have to own the intellectual property. Because when you own the intellectual property, then you can go out here and make business deals with different companies as related to licensing images of your characters, licensing merchandise featuring images of your characters, and you can generate revenue for yourself as related to those characters. But when you work for hire, the company owns the characters, and they are hiring you as a contract worker to go out here and do contract work, whether it be writing, whether it be art, whether it be the cover, whether it be editing. You are just a contract worker, and all you have to do is submit your work to that editor in order to get paid. And that's the beginning and end as related to comic publishing and publishing overall. And again, this is why comic publishing is considered low tier, because the writers and artists don't own anything, so that they cannot claim anything. And unionization doesn't work in this business because most creators usually just take their characters and they own their own characters, and they go out here and they sell their own characters and profit through those ventures, because they know that taking your product to a company for work for hire, like Rob Liefeld did with Deadpool, only leads to you, the company, making billions of dollars and you winding up with no money. And that's why many creators today no longer take their characters to places like DC or Marvel, because they know that that's going to lead to them winding up in the poorhouse, and a union isn't going to help with that, because this company is going to generate this type of money off of your characters. But that's just kind of foolish to take it over there when you can take it to your own business, which is what a lot of comic pros are doing right now. And that's why they're funding things like Kickstarters and Indiegogos and going into business for themselves, because they see it as a way to generate wealth for themselves. So the whole argument of unionizing comic pros is something that I believe came too little too late, because the only time we could have done that possibly was the late 80s and early 90s, when we had Marvel and DC in a position where artists were considered an asset, where artists like Todd McFarlane were selling 500,000 Spider-Mans every month, and people like Jim Lee were selling 500,000 X-Men every month. That was the time to talk about unionization. But during that same time, many comic pros decided to talk about going into business for themselves, because, again, they saw higher value as related to their talent, higher value as related to their work, and they saw ownership as having the highest value and being a possibility of generating wealth on their own intellectual property. So that's why we don't see unionization of comic pros, and that's why freelance work at comic pros is considered still work for hire, and can still considered the lowest tier of work in publishing, because in publishing, usually most people who are doing comics are doing them just either because they love the craft, they love the characters, or they just have a passion for comics, and they usually have other jobs on the side, and this is just one of those jobs they have on the side. But many people, like the woke types who have tried to infiltrate the comic book industry, they're thinking that this is a job you can do every day for profit, but it's not a job you can do every day for a profit. I mean, if you really want to get real serious about profits, and there aren't that many in publishing overall, you would graduate to more profitable ventures like writing a novel or branching out and doing the research into some nonfiction, which is considered the highest level in publishing. Once you start doing nonfiction, you can really clean up because it's primarily you doing research on facts, and people always have money for a nonfiction book because they always want to learn something. So when you have people like, again, Aubrey Stitterson coming in talking about unions, he's completely clueless about the comic book industry. He's completely clueless about publishing, and he doesn't really understand how the business works. And him coming out here talking about unions when an industry is in decline shows how completely out of touch he is, because he's sitting there, he was working on IDW, and he was talking about the Twin Towers in a negative fashion and alienating customers, not understanding that him alienating customers was driving away the little business that IDW was having. And there's no way to, again, guarantee a job in comics, because comics, again, are not an essential asset as related to people's everyday lives. People can get by without a comic. I mean, people can't get by without electricity, but comics, people can pick or choose whether they buy this product, and it's not something anybody would unionize behind, because you people unionize behind essential services, and a comic, at the end of the day, when you really think about it from a publisher's perspective and a real world perspective, is not something essential, and the workers there are not really considered essential to most media companies, businesses. Again, they only are hiring these people so that they can keep these trademarks in place. And once the trademark is in place, they can do that easily by they don't even need to even publish comics to do this. They can just give this over to another publishing division, and that's what I think companies like Warner Brothers and Disney are really thinking about, because all they want to do is protect their intellectual property, and they want to protect that intellectual property at the lowest cost. So that's why they're probably thinking about, well, if we get rid of this comic division, or we streamline this comic division like Warner Brothers is doing right now, we're going to take somebody from one of our trade divisions, put them in charge of that publishing division, and just publish these books, or outsource the publishing of these books, just to keep these trademarks in place so we can continue making money. So when I listen to the whole proposal about unions, it's a laughable one, and it's a laughable one because anyone who understands the business of publishing understands that if you're coming in with comics, you need to understand that this is, while it's fun and entertaining, you have to start thinking about other ventures, and you have to start thinking about graduating to other ventures, whether it be graduating to writing a novel, or going out here and branching out into nonfiction, or going out here and owning your own intellectual property, or doing commissions. You have to do things that allow you to generate revenue, and you have to do things long term that help you generate wealth. If you'd like to see me make more videos about comics and the comic book industry, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you want to try some of my SJS Direct publications like the Isis series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, the books of the Spinsterella trilogy, and the Thetas, you can pick up all of those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them on Smashwords, Barnes & Noble, and the iBookstore and Google Play. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, subscribe.
Those who refuse the gift of eternal life are condemned to wander in the darkness of eternal